Okay, we're going to start talking about the last part of this unit, which is dealing with social psychology and the value that goes into the research that social psychologists do. One of the big problems that comes in social psychology and the study of it a lot of times is that many times a social psychologist wants to keep things objective. Their goal is to try to keep as much of their own personal values, their own personal beliefs, their own ideas out of the research. But that is where it becomes a problem, because they also want to be able to come up with the findings that supports their hypothesis. And so that gets into a lot of conflicting interests for a social psychologist, and that is where the difficulties kind of come into play. When it comes to social psychology and the whole idea of being objective, it's less of a collection of findings than strategies to answer the question. So when you have a scientific work versus values of finding, a lot of times a social psychologist has to be very careful with their research, and they have to try to keep it as much as they can independent from what they're wanting to find. But that also plays a very big role into replication, because if I'm a social psychologist and I do a research study based upon the concept of happiness or based upon some other social behavior, and my findings come out to show a certain statistical research analysis, then somebody else could do my exact same study, and that's the importance of keeping the studies very well documented. And if their research comes out to be the same, then we can find that there's a higher correlation. If it doesn't, then again it shows that there has been some bias into my research. So when it comes to social psychology, there are some obvious ways that values do enter into it. First off, social psychology is a reflection of social history. And what that means is that if you go back over the years of social psychology, going way back into the 1930s when really it started to take off as a field of psychology there, you would begin to see that what was the major studies being done by social psychologists oftentimes was relating to what was going on in history at the time. So for example, World War II. Social psychologists were heavily into research dealing with concepts about Hitler and about Nazism and about fascism and about how people could be duped or persuaded or convinced into believing into something that clearly was against what their values and ideals were. Then you get into the 1950s and 1960s, and we had in the United States going on a lot of history dealing with racism and dealing with prejudice and discrimination and dealing with the concepts of blacks and whites and the separation and then the integration. You get into the 70s and it gets into, again, a lot of hostility towards the government and Vietnam. And then you get into the 1980s, which would be materialism and the concept of being able to be wealthy and having it all. And today the social psychologists get into a lot of studies, especially dealing with, after 9/11, the concepts about, again, racism, but now it's expanding that into not just color, but also into religious ideas, and it gets also into the sexual ideas about homosexuality. So basically, again, when it comes to the field of social psychology, there is a lot of bias or a lot of ways that values do enter into it because of what social psychologists want to study. The second one has to do with the differences in culture. In our society, Western society, we kind of tend to lean more towards social identity. We're looking at individual studies. We're looking at how individuals relate to society and how society relates back onto individuals. Where in Eastern societies, their research is more conclusive on social cooperation. The third, then, is how our values are influenced by the people. And again, just think about it, look in school settings. When you go to an art department and you see all the art history majors and music people, those individuals are going to be, they look different, they act different, they have different values, different ideas, different concepts than, say, someone who is majoring in PE or someone who is majoring in government or someone who's majoring in English. We all tend to lean more towards the areas that we feel comfortable in. And as that happens to be in the field of social psychology, then psychologists tend to lean in their viewpoints towards certain aspects and certain beliefs and values and ideas about how life should be then. Okay, the next slide we're going to get into is what are some of the not so obvious ways that values enter in psychology. First off, take a look at the picture, and as you see the picture, I want you to kind of decide what exactly it is that you see. And you need, some of you are going to say that you're seeing an old woman, and some of you are going to say, well, you see a young woman, and actually you see both. But what was the first impression you got right when you first saw it? Was it the old woman or young woman? And again, in psychology, one of the things that you look at is, sometimes, you look at that and go, I don't see the young woman. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't see the old woman. And so you have to be pointed out. And then once you see it, it becomes very obvious to you. And you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I see it all the time. But a lot of times in psychology, especially when you're studying about humans and the way we behave, the way that we do things is not so obvious until after the fact. And then once we see it, then all of a sudden becomes really easy to understand. But when you look at that picture there, especially, the whole idea there, when it comes to social psychology, is that things are not purely objective. It's not just one or the other. In this case, the picture shows both, a young and old woman. And when it comes to psychology, many times how we interpret things can be misinterpreted or can be interpreted in several different ways. And that's what makes psychology, again, very difficult. We view the world through multicolored glasses. A lot of times we will see the things we want to see, and or we don't see the things that are right in front of us. And a lot of times, again, you probably can make examples of times where you'll see something and you can't figure out why somebody else who's with you cannot see the same thing that's going on. For example, a lot of times people are very surprised when they find out that they are that the person that they've been dating or going out or being with all of a sudden breaks up with them. And they'll go to one of their friends and say, man, I didn't see this coming at all, did you? And yeah, they'll see it very easily, and they'll say, yeah, it was pretty easy to figure out. Why is that? Well, again, we sometimes don't want to see the things that's right in front of us. And that's a fascinating part of psychology, is to figuring out why. All right, some of the hidden values of psychology. When it comes to psychology and when it comes to what we call the value judgments versus facts, here it gets into difficulty when we're trying to define such things as a good life, happiness, success, failure. What exactly is a self-actualized person, according to Maslow, who says that we all try to achieve this high level of self-actualization, this perfect being. And what exactly is that? Well, again, in Maslow's theory, he had an idea what that meant. But for some of us, that's not the same thing. For some of us, happiness could be money, it could be materialism, it could be somebody who you love. There's a lot of different aspects to it, a lot of different interpretations to that. Same thing with the second one, number 2. Advice on how to do such things as childbearing, or what is the purpose of life, or what exactly constitutes success, and all that. You could go to one person and they could say, well, success is being able to have a great job and being able to have a nice home and being able to have a family. Somebody else could come back and say, no. They could say that being happy or being successful in life is basically feeling good inside. Or it could be a religious aspect. So for all of us, it's a little different. Forming concepts of what is exactly our high self-esteem and low self-concept. Here again, it's very difficult when psychologists are making these studies and to be able to sit there and say, well, this person has a high self-esteem or this person has a low self-esteem. What exactly constitutes a high or low self-esteem? And that gets kind of difficult making those kind of judgments. And then, of course, labeling also becomes a very big part of psychology. And again, when you label, a lot of times that interpretation of that label can be misconstrued. For us, we see those people of 9/11 as terrorists who bombed the World Trade Center and killed thousands of people. For other people of the Islamic fundamentalist groups that supported that organization, they saw those people as freedom fighters. You know, in the United States back in the Revolutionary War, we were looked upon as traitors to the people of Great Britain. And yet we saw, you know, our patriots as heroes. So it's all a matter of interpretation of where you see your values and where do you see things fitting into that. And it's kind of hard to do. Okay, so now it gets into this whole concept of common sense. And that's one of the biggest criticisms of social psychology, is this idea that, you know, as we're going to start going through a lot more of this information in social psychology, and as some of the stuff that we've already talked about, some people will look at this and go, this is just too easy. It's so obvious. How do you not know this? How does this not, you know, why is this something we have to study about if we should be able to pick this up so fast and so quickly? And the problem in social psychology is, yeah, things look really obvious until actually you put them into practice. And so a lot of times I'll have my students, especially in this class, think, wow, this is going to be a pretty easy class, and I don't have to study for it because it's really common sense stuff. Well, actually, a lot of times common sense is wrong. And so you have to be careful in the field of social psychology, because the dangers of sometimes thinking that things look so obvious when actually they don't. And we're going to talk a little more about that as we get into it. But if you remember, going back to the very first slide we got into, I did that activity with you guys, and we went through some of those. You know, the idea that the concept of separation makes the heart grow fonder, or is it actually the other concept that, you know, out of sight, out of mind? Is the concept that deals with love is stronger than fear, or is it fear that's stronger than love? That's where it gets into the questions like that, and then a lot of times you'll look at that and you'll say, well, you can't make a judgment on it until often you do the study. And once the study comes out, and once the findings come out, and you come out and say, well, according to this research study, absence does make the heart grow fonder. Well, of course it does. And, you know, again, it looks really obvious then to you once the study's done. But in actuality, that's why we do this field of social psychology, is to find those things out. So things are not as obvious as they seem. One of the other problems that we get into is this concept of I knew it all along, because we just don't like to let people know that we are surprised. We don't like to let people know that sometimes we are wrong or we didn't know the answer to something. I know a lot of times in the summer when, you know, some of the different jobs I do, and when I have my gym, I'll have some coaches, and I'll say to them, okay, you know, I want you to take this group of kids and go work on this skill. Do you know how to do the teaching for it? Oh, yeah. And I'll look over, and that coach is not doing anything close to what they need to be doing to be teaching that skill for the gymnastics. And so I have to go back over and, you know, redo it and then say, well, why did you say you knew it? Well, I just thought I knew it, or I just didn't want to tell you I didn't know it. And we do that a lot. You know, it's not just kids who do that, but adults do that too. We tend to sometimes, you know, not want to show our frailties, and so we'll just automatically say, oh yeah, I can do that, or I see that, or I know what I'm doing, and in actuality we don't. And that, again, social psychologists have to really take that into perspective when they're doing their research and findings. We call this a lot of times hindsight. You know, this 20/20 thing where we look back at something and we say, oh yeah, that was so obvious, I should have seen that. You know, and not too long ago I was talking to my brother, and we were talking about the past and how we were, you know, some of the things we did in our past were stupid mistakes. And you look back at those things and you think, you know, what the hell was I thinking when I did that? Well, at the time, it didn't seem so stupid. Because when we do things, a lot of times we think that that's the best thing to do. So you don't study for a test, you fail the test, you look back at it and say, damn, that was an idiot thing I should have done. Well, probably before you went in and took the test, you didn't study because maybe you told yourself, oh, I know this stuff pretty good, I'm going to do fine on it, and then you don't study. That's the problem with hindsight, is a lot of times we end up forgetting to see what we need to do. And so in social psychology, one of the concepts of that is that we need to forget about our earlier views and learn to focus more on our current perceptions to be able to get things done right.